On a freezing winter morning, a struggling war veteran heard a sound no one else noticed. Not a cry, not a bark. Just a weak, trembling noise drifting from a frozen drainage pipe. Inside, he found a tiny puppy barely alive, shaking, silent, and completely alone. With no money, no safety net, and his own trauma still haunting him, he carried the pup to a small-town clinic. But what happened at that front desk forced him to lay down more than his pride. Would you beg if a life depended on it? And could saving one fragile soul help heal two broken men and a dog with two fathers? Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments and subscribe for stories that restore faith in humanity. Winter had settled deep into the town, heavy and unyielding. Snow crusted the sidewalks, the sky stayed the color of old steel, and the cold crept into places it didn't belong. The kind of cold that lingered, even indoors. Mark Wilson woke before dawn, as he always did. Not because he needed to, there was no schedule demanding it, but because his body never trusted sleep to last. He lay still for a moment on the narrow bed, eyes open, listening. Pipes hummed. Wind scraped along the side of the building. Somewhere far off, a truck shifted gears. Only then did he sit up. At 46, Mark moved with the economy of someone who had learned long ago not to waste energy. Broad-shouldered, lean from years of physical labor. His frame still carried the disciplined strength of a soldier, though time had softened the edges. His hair, once dark, was threaded with gray now, cropped short more out of habit than preference. A thin beard shadowed his jaw, not styled, just unattended. His eyes were steady but distant, the kind that missed nothing while revealing very little. He dressed the same way every morning, thick work boots, faded jeans, a flannel layered over a thermal shirt. Practical clothes, purposeful. There were no mirrors in the room. He'd taken one down years ago and never replaced it. The apartment above the garage was sparse, not unfinished, just empty in a careful way. Tools lined the walls in clean rows, sorted by use. A small table, a chair with one leg slightly shorter than the others. No photographs, no decorations. Nothing that asked to be remembered. Mark preferred it that way. He brewed coffee strong enough to bite back and drank it standing near the window, staring at the pale glow of morning pressing against the snow. Silence filled the room, thick and waiting. He found himself counting his breaths without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. When the present felt solid again, he grabbed his coat and headed downstairs. The garage smelled of oil, cold metal, and old wood. His truck waited inside, a battered pickup with rusted edges and a heater that only worked when it felt like it. He made his living fixing what other people couldn't or wouldn't. Broken fences, frozen pipes, doors that refused to close all the way. It wasn't much, but it was honest, and it kept his hands busy. Busy hands meant quieter nights. Mark checked his phone. No new messages. That was normal. He told himself it was fine. He was halfway through loading his tools when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, a trick of the cold funneling through alleyways. He froze, one hand still wrapped around the handle of a wrench. His shoulders tightened, muscles responding before his mind could catch up. The sound came again. Not loud, not sharp, small. Mark held his breath. It wasn't enough to demand attention, only enough to ask for it. His chest tightened in a way he didn't recognize at first. Then recognition hit, slow and unwelcome. The sound wasn't mechanical. It wasn't the scrape of metal or the groan of ice. It was alive. Easy, he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to, himself or whatever was out there. He stepped outside, boots crunching against the snow. The alley behind the garage was narrow, cluttered with trash bins and half-buried debris. The cold cut through his jacket instantly, sharp and invasive. His breath fogged in the air as he scanned the shadows. There, near the storm drain. Mark approached cautiously, each step measured. He crouched, ignoring the protest in his knees, and peered down. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. Then something shifted. A shape. too small. Curled tight against the concrete, barely moving, was a puppy, no bigger than a loaf of bread. Its fur was matted with ice, pale with frost, ribs rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. One ear twitched weakly, as if responding to a sound only it could hear. Mark swore under his breath, not in anger, but in disbelief. "Hey," he said quietly, voice low and steady. "Hey there." The puppy didn't lift its head, but its breathing hitched and a thin sound escaped its throat. Not a bark, not a whimper. Something fragile in between. Mark felt it then. That tightening behind the ribs. The one he spent years pretending didn't exist. He reached out, hesitated, then pulled his hand back. His fingers curled into a fist. He didn't trust himself with fragile things. Never had. The cold was stealing time. He knew that much. "All right," he said, more firmly now. "All right." He shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it carefully around the puppy, moving slowly so he wouldn't startle it. The animal barely reacted. Its body was frighteningly light in his hands. As he lifted it, the puppy's head shifted weakly, nose pressing against his wrist as if drawn by warmth. Mark stiffened. His breath caught. It wasn't fear that rose in him. It was something worse. Responsibility. He stood there longer than he meant to, snow seeping into his boots, the weight of the small body settling into his arms. The world seemed to narrow until there was only the sound of his own breathing and the fragile rhythm against his chest. "Don't do this," he murmured, though he didn't pull away. He turned toward the truck. Driving through town, Mark kept one hand on the wheel and the other cupped protectively around the bundle on the passenger seat. The heater sputtered, then gave up entirely. He adjusted the coat, tucking it closer. Images pressed in uninvited, cold nights, shallow breathing. Waiting for help that didn't always come. He pushed them down. The veterinary clinic lights glowed ahead, warm and steady against the gray morning. Mark pulled into the lot and shut off the engine. For a moment, he stayed where he was. He thought of all the times he had walked away before things could hurt. All the times. Survival had meant leaving first. The puppy stirred, letting out another faint sound. Not a plea, just a presence. Mark exhaled slowly and opened the door. Inside the clinic, warmth hit him like a wave. He stepped forward, shoulders tense, coat still wrapped tightly around what he carried. His boots left wet prints on the floor. His voice faltered. He cleared his throat. "I found him outside." Someone behind the counter looked up, eyes widening. "Sir," "He was freezing," Mark said, words tumbling out faster now. "Barely breathing. I didn't know where else to go." The puppy shifted again, pressing faintly into his arm. Mark looked down at it, jaw tightening. His grip softened without him realizing it. For the first time in a long while, he hadn't walked away. And for reasons he didn't yet understand, that felt like a decision. The warmth of the clinic hit him a second too late. Mark stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft, pneumatic hiss that sounded far too much like a seal locking into place. The cold clung to his clothes anyway, worked its way into the seams of his jacket, into his fingers, into the places warmth didn't reach right away. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, adjusting his grip on the small bundle in his arms, reminding himself where he was. Safe, indoors, present. The tiny body pressed against his chest shuddered faintly. Mark moved farther in, boots leaving wet prints on the pale tile floor. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and metal, and something faintly sweet beneath it all. Clean, controlled, unfamiliar. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and bright, washing the room in a colorless glow that made every shadow feel sharper. His heart began to climb. Not fast, not yet. Just enough to notice. He angled himself toward the wall near the waiting area and leaned his shoulder against it, careful not to jostle the puppy. The motion looked casual from the outside, like a man catching his balance. Inside, it was a practice maneuver, one he'd learned years ago, long before small rooms and bright lights had started to feel dangerous. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The puppy shifted weakly, its breath brushing against his wrist in uneven puffs. Mark lowered his head until his forehead almost touched the top of the bundle, listening, counting the seconds between breaths. Still breathing. That mattered. A low metal clink sounded somewhere down the hall, a tray being set down, tools touching stainless steel. The sound slipped under his skin and lodged there, unwelcome. His shoulders tightened before he could stop them. The room felt narrower, the lights harsher. Mark pressed his palm flat against his chest, just left of center, grounding himself in the steady resistance of bone and muscle. 1, 2, 3. The noise passed. The room stayed. He exhaled slowly and scanned the waiting area. 2 chairs along one wall, a rack of pamphlets he didn't read, a counter ahead, tall enough to feel like a barrier even from here. No one looked at him directly. A woman in scrubs crossed the space with a clipboard tucked under her arm, eyes already somewhere else. Another figure disappeared through a door farther down the hall. Busy, not cruel, just busy. Mark shifted his weight and stepped toward the bench near the wall. He eased the puppy down onto a folded towel someone had left there earlier, moving with the same care he used when setting down fragile tools. The animal barely reacted, its body frighteningly light as it settled. Its ribs fluttered beneath its skin, breath shallow and uneven, like it was trying not to wake itself. Mark crouched beside the bench, eyes level with the small rise and fall of its chest. "Hey," he murmured, barely more than air. "I'm here." The puppy's ear twitched, just once, not in response. More like reflex. He leaned closer, close enough to feel the faint warmth leaking from the towel, close enough to be certain the puppy hadn't stopped breathing while he wasn't looking. His jaw tightened. He forced it to relax again. "Not yet. Stay steady." Another metallic sound echoed down the corridor, this one sharper. Mark flinched before he could stop himself, fingers curling into the towel. The room tilted for a fraction of a second, not enough to fall, but enough to remind him how easily it could happen. He straightened slowly, back against the wall again, hand to chest. 1, 2, 3. A memory tried to surface then. Cold floors, white lights, the smell of disinfectant layered over fear. But he pushed it back down before it could take shape. This wasn't that. This wasn't then. The puppy let out a thin sound, barely audible, not a whimper, not a cry, something smaller, apologetic almost. Mark swallowed hard. "I know," he whispered. "I know." A pair of footsteps passed behind him. Someone glanced at the bench, at the towel, at the small, shaking form on it. Their gaze lingered for a second, long enough to register concern, but then they kept moving. No pause, no questions yet. Mark watched them go, something tight twisting low in his chest. Not anger, something quieter. The familiar weight of being unseen. He looked back down at the puppy and forced his breathing to match its rhythm. Shallow, careful, present. Minutes passed that way. Or maybe seconds. Time did strange things in rooms like this. The lights hummed. A phone rang somewhere. A door opened and closed again. The puppy's breathing stuttered. Mark was on his feet instantly, hands hovering uselessly over the towel. His pulse spiked, sharp and hot. He bent low, ear close to the tiny chest, listening harder than before. Still there, still breathing. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and closed his eyes for half a second. Just half. Long enough to steady himself. When he opened them again, the counter didn't feel quite so far away. Mark gathered the puppy back into his arms, cradling it close. The towel slipped, but he caught it, tucking it tighter, shielding the small body from the draft he hadn't noticed before. He straightened his shoulders. Whatever came next, he would stay upright for it. He took one step toward the counter, then another. Each footfall sounded too loud on the tile. Each breath felt deliberate. He could feel the weight of eyes now, not fixed on him exactly, but aware, expectant. Mark stopped just short of the desk, fingers tightening around the bundle. He glanced down once more at the puppy, memorizing the feel of it there, the fragile warmth, the faint rise and fall. "I've got you," he said softly, to the puppy, to himself. Then he lifted his head and faced the counter. Morning light filtered weakly through the frosted windows of Silver Pine Veterinary Clinic, turning the white walls a dull gray. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered, stubborn and unmoved, as if it had claimed the town for itself. Inside, The clinic hummed with quiet tension, phones murmuring, machines clicking softly, the muted sounds of animals waiting behind closed doors. Mark stood at the front desk, shoulders squared, the puppy cradled close to his chest. The small body was warmer now, but still trembled in shallow waves, each breath thin and careful. Mark felt every one of them against his ribs. The receptionist on duty that morning was a woman Mark hadn't seen before. She was in her late 20s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with straight blonde hair tucked neatly behind her ears. Her skin was pale and unmarked, her posture precise, as if order itself were a shield. She wore her scrubs crisply, eyes moving between the computer screen and Mark with professional distance. Her name tag read Sarah Klein. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, fingers resting lightly on the counter. Her voice wasn't unkind, just measured. "Without a deposit, we can't proceed with treatment." Mark nodded once, jaw tightening. He'd expected this. Still, something in his chest shifted. The old familiar sensation of standing at the wrong counter, asking the wrong question. "I'm not asking for surgery," he said quietly. "Just check his temperature, that's all." Sarah hesitated, eyes flicking to the puppy. Its tiny paws twitched, claws scraping faintly against the fabric of Mark's coat. A sound slipped from its throat, barely there, more breath than noise. It wasn't pain exactly. It sounded like apology. Mark swallowed. "I can leave something," he said. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and placed an old wristwatch on the counter. The leather strap was cracked with age, the metal face scratched dull. "This was my father's." Sarah's eyes softened for a fraction of a second before she looked back at the screen. "Sir, Mark set his truck keys beside the watch, then his tool pouch, worn canvas stained with years of oil and sawdust. He unzipped it just enough for the metal to glint under the lights. "I'll come back, I always do." He wasn't begging, not really. He was offering proof of a life built on returning. The puppy shuddered again, pressing its nose weakly into the hollow of Mark's arm. That sound came once more, soft, almost embarrassed. Mark bent slightly, lowering his head until his mouth was near the puppy's ear. "You didn't do anything wrong," he murmured. The words surprised him as they left his mouth. He realized, too late, that he wasn't sure who they were meant for. Sarah exhaled, fingers curling against the counter. She looked past Mark, toward the hallway. "Emily," she called, not loudly. Footsteps approached. Emily Carter appeared from the back, sleeves rolled, hair escaping its tie. She took in the scene in seconds. The watch, the keys, the tools, the way Mark stood unnaturally still. "What's going on?" Emily asked. Sarah gestured toward the counter. "Policy," she said, almost apologetically. Emily didn't answer right away. She stepped closer, eyes moving to the puppy. Its sides fluttered with each breath, the tremor unmistakable. "How long was he outside?" Emily asked Mark. "I don't know," Mark said. "Long enough." Emily nodded once, then she turned to Sarah. "I'll take this case." Sarah hesitated. "Emily—" "I know," Emily said, gently but firmly. "I'll log it under my name." Sarah looked between them, then down at the items on the counter. Finally, she nodded and slid them back toward Mark. "I'll note it as deferred," she said quietly. Mark stared at Emily. "You don't have to do this." Emily met his gaze. Her eyes held no drama, no savior's glow, just conviction shaped by long nights and hard losses. "I do," she said, "because sometimes the right thing costs something." They moved quickly then. Emily ushered Mark into a smaller exam room, dimmer than the others, quieter. She took the puppy gently, hands practiced but tender, wrapping it in warm towels before placing a thermometer beneath its tiny flank. Mark stood rigidly beside the table, hands empty now, unsure where to put them. "Low," Emily said softly, reading the screen. "Still dangerous, but better than before." Mark closed his eyes briefly. His shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him all at once. Emily glanced at him. "You okay?" He nodded, though his throat burned. I don't like owing people. Emily smiled faintly. Then don't think of it that way. The puppy stirred again, releasing another faint sound. Emily paused, listening. He's vocalizing more, she said. That's a good sign. Mark watched the tiny chest rise and fall. He sounds like he's saying sorry. Emily looked at him, curiosity flickering. That's not what I hear, she said. I hear someone who wants to stay. Something settled in Mark's chest at that. When they were finished, Emily handed the puppy back, bundled tightly. You'll need to keep him warm, she said, and bring him back tomorrow. I will, Mark said. No hesitation this time. At the door he paused. Pride still sat heavy in him. But it felt different now. Less like armor, more like something that could be set down. Thank you, he said. Emily nodded. See you tomorrow, Mark. Outside, the cold met him again, but it no longer felt like punishment. The puppy shifted in his arms, warmer, heavier than before. Mark adjusted his coat and walked toward his truck, carrying more than he had when he came in, but somehow standing lighter. Night settled over Silver Pine, with a quiet that felt heavier than the snow itself. The clinic lights dimmed to their evening glow, soft and amber, turning the hallways into narrow rivers of warmth against the cold. Outside, the town held its breath. Inside, the puppy lay wrapped in layers of clean towels beneath a low heating lamp, its tiny body still fighting to remember how to keep itself alive. Emily Carter stood at the foot of the exam table, arms folded loosely, watching the monitor with a calm that had been earned rather than learned. In her mid-30s, Emily carried herself with a grounded steadiness. Average height, athletic build, dark hair pulled into a practical knot that never quite held through long shifts. Her face bore faint lines around the eyes, not from age but from years of concentration and nights that had demanded more than they should. She spoke softly by habit, not gentleness, the way people did when they understood that volume rarely equaled authority. He needs to stay, she said, not looking up. Hypothermia rebounds sometimes. We warm him too fast. His body can crash. Mark nodded, though his attention never left the small shape beneath the towels. The puppy's chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, each breath a careful negotiation. Its fur, still damp despite the warmth, lay flattened against its ribs, revealing how little there was beneath. The pale coat carried faint markings that hinted at something sturdier it might one day become, but for now it looked unfinished, as if the world had rushed it into being and then forgotten to come back. Can I? Mark began, then stopped. He wasn't sure what he was asking for. Permission, maybe, or forgiveness. Emily glanced at him. You can sit with him, she said. Just don't touch unless he moves toward you. She pulled a chair close to the table and stepped aside. Mark took the seat slowly, as if any sudden movement might break the fragile balance holding the night together. He folded his hands in his lap. For a long moment, he simply breathed, matching the slow cadence of the room. The puppy shivered once, a small ripple passing through its body. A sound escaped its throat, thin, uneven, barely there. Mark leaned forward, stopping short of contact. It's okay, he whispered. His voice came out rougher than he intended, like something pulled from deep water. You're safe. The words lingered in the air between them. The puppy's ears twitched, its breathing hitched, then steadied, as if the sound had found something it recognized. Mark swallowed. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm fabric. Somewhere down the hall, a dog barked once, and then fell quiet. The clock ticked. Time passed differently here, stretched and thinned until moments felt both endless and brief. Mark spoke again, softer this time. You don't have to do anything, he said, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of the tiny chest. Just stay. The puppy stirred. Its head shifted weakly, muzzle turning toward Mark's voice. A breathy sound followed. Not a bark, not a whine, but something shaped by effort. It rose, then fell, echoing the curve of Mark's tone in a warped, fragile way. Mark froze. He hadn't imagined it. He knew the difference. Years of listening for danger had taught him that much. Emily looked up from the monitor. "Did you hear that?" she asked quietly. Mark nodded, unable to speak. The puppy made the sound again, just as soft, just as deliberate. It wasn't mimicry in any scientific sense. It wasn't language, but it was response. Mark's chest tightened. His breath caught halfway in. He leaned closer, lowering his voice until it was almost nothing. "I'm here," he said, not to reassure, to state a fact. The puppy's throat worked. Another sound emerged, thinner now, but unmistakably shaped by the same rhythm. The answer wasn't perfect. It wasn't clear, but it was there. Something inside Mark gave way. He pressed the heel of his hand into his eye, hard enough to hurt, but the tears came anyway. Quietly, without warning. He didn't turn away. He didn't apologize. For the first time in years, he let the moment take what it needed. Emily pretended to check the IV line. She gave him the courtesy of privacy without absence. "I'm sorry," Mark murmured, though he didn't know to whom. The puppy shifted again, nose nudging faintly against the edge of the towel. The movement was weak, uncoordinated, but purposeful. It pressed closer to the warmth of Mark's presence, as if the space between them mattered. Mark laughed softly through his tears. The sound surprised him. It felt foreign, like trying on a word he hadn't used in a long time. "You did that?" he said, voice breaking. "You answered." The puppy made another small sound, then settled, breathing deepening by fractions. The monitor ticked steadily, numbers inching toward safer ground. Emily returned to the table. "He's stabilizing," she said. "Not out of danger, but he's fighting." Mark wiped his face with the back of his hand. "He's stubborn." Emily smiled. "Good." The night wore on. Emily checked vitals, adjusted the lamp, and left Mark alone again. Hours passed measured by the clock and the slow warming of a tiny body. Mark spoke to the puppy the way he had never spoken to anyone, not filling silence, not explaining, just naming what was true. "It's cold out there," he said at one point, "but you don't have to go back tonight." The puppy breathed. "You don't owe me anything," he said later. "Just stay." Another soft sound, closer this time. Mark rested his forearms on his knees, leaning in until the warmth of the lamp brushed his face. Memories tried to surface. Other nights, other rooms, voices calling into darkness that never answered. He didn't push them away. He let them pass. Near dawn, the puppy stirred more fully. Its eyes fluttered open, dark, unfocused, but searching. It made a small, questioning noise, rising at the end like an unfinished thought. Mark felt it land somewhere deep and careful inside him. "Scout," he said suddenly, without planning it. The name came from nowhere and everywhere at once, from patrols that had gone first, from men who watched the road ahead so others could follow, from the part of himself that still believed someone had to go out front. The puppy's ears twitched. "Scout," Mark repeated, quieter. "You're a scout. You found your way out." The puppy made the sound again, this time almost matching the curve of the word, not saying it, answering it. Mark closed his eyes, breath shaking. "Okay," he whispered, "then lead." When morning finally broke, light seeped through the windows, pale and tentative. Emily returned with coffee and a tired smile. "He made it through the night," she said. Mark nodded, eyes never leaving Scout. His voice was steady now. "So did I." Morning returned to Silver Pine gently, as if careful not to startle anything fragile. Snow still clung to the edges of the roads, but the sky had softened from steel to pale blue. Inside the clinic, Scout slept in a shallow rise and fall of breath, warmer now, steadier, his small body no longer fighting the cold at every second. Mark sat beside him, same chair, same posture, but something inside him had shifted. The night before had cracked something open, not painfully, but permanently. He watched Scout's chest, counting breaths without realizing it, until Emily's voice broke the pattern. "He's responding well," she said. Emily stood near the doorway with a clipboard tucked under her arm. She looked tired this morning, dark circles faintly visible beneath her eyes, but there was a quiet satisfaction in her expression. Temperature's holding, hydration's good. He's not out of the woods yet, but he wants to be here. Mark nodded. He's stubborn. Emily smiled faintly. That helps. Over the next few days, Mark returned to the clinic whenever Emily allowed it. Sometimes he sat for hours, sometimes just minutes between jobs. Scout grew stronger in small, almost invisible ways. His breathing deepened, his shivering faded. His eyes began to track movement with something like curiosity instead of fear. And then there was the tapping. It started one afternoon when Mark leaned too far into a memory he hadn't meant to visit. A metallic clatter in the back room, someone dropping a tray, sent his shoulders locking, breath hitching hard in his chest. He hadn't realized how tight his jaw had become until he tasted blood. Tap, tap, tap. 3 soft knocks against the blanket. Mark froze. His gaze snapped to Scout. The puppy's paw rested weakly against the fabric, claws barely visible. He hadn't lifted his head. He hadn't barked. Just those 3 taps, uneven but intentional. Mark exhaled sharply, air rushing back into his lungs. His hands unclenched. He dropped his gaze, pressing his palm flat against his thigh, grounding himself in the solid weight of the chair, the floor, the room. Scout's paw fell back, the effort spent. From that moment on, it became their language. Whenever Mark's breathing quickened, whenever his eyes glazed over and the room began to slip sideways, Scout tapped. Sometimes once, sometimes twice, often 3 times. Not loud, not demanding, just enough to be felt. Emily noticed it on the 3rd day. He does that when you're tense, she said quietly, watching from the counter. Mark shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. Probably coincidence? Emily didn't argue. She'd learned when to let truths speak for themselves. The clinic eventually discharged Scout to Mark's care under strict instructions. Warmth, quiet, return visits, no sudden stress. Emily made it clear this was temporary. Foster care until Scout was strong enough for the next step. Mark signed the papers with steady hands. Back in the apartment above the garage, the space felt different with Scout inside it. The emptiness no longer felt intentional. Scout slept in a box lined with old towels near the heater, his body curled tight, nose tucked beneath his tail. Mark moved carefully, aware of every sound he made, as if the walls themselves might wake something dangerous. The first night home, Mark woke gasping, heart pounding, sweat cold against his skin. No tapping. The silence hit harder than the panic. His chest tightened, the room narrowed, the old sensations flooded in. Pressure, noise without sound, the sense of being trapped in a moment that refused to end. He sat up, fists clenched, eyes darting to corners that weren't there. Scout slept on. Mark waited, counted seconds. Nothing. The panic surged. He swung his legs over the bed, feet pressing into the floor, grounding himself the way therapists had once taught him. He placed a hand flat against his chest and another against the wall, cold and solid. Breathe, he whispered. The word felt thin, useless. His breath came fast anyway. In, out, too shallow. He squeezed his eyes shut and forced himself to notice what was real. The hum of the heater, the smell of oil and old wood, the ache in his knees, the faint rise and fall of Scout's breathing. 1, 2, 3. His heart slowed by degrees, not miracles. When he opened his eyes, Scout was awake. The puppy hadn't moved from his box. He hadn't lifted his head, but his paw stretched just far enough to touch the edge of the towel. Tap, tap, barely there. Mark laughed softly, the sound shaky but real. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, breath finally evening out. Yeah, he murmured, I've got it. Scout's paw dropped back. His breathing deepened again, trusting the night to hold. Mark stayed awake a long time after that, not because he was afraid to sleep, but because he understood something new. Scout hadn't pulled him out of the panic. Scout hadn't fixed it. Scout had reminded him how. In the days that followed, Mark practiced. When the tension rose, he didn't wait for the taps. He counted. He pressed his feet into the floor. He named what was real. Scout watched, sometimes tapping, sometimes not. One afternoon, Emily stopped by unexpectedly. She stood in the doorway, watching as Mark knelt to refill Scout's water bowl, his movements calm, deliberate. "You look steadier," she said. Mark glanced up. "I'm learning." Emily nodded toward Scout. "He's learning too." That night, Scout slept without tapping at all, and Mark slept anyway. The clinic was quieter than usual that afternoon, the kind of hush that settled in places where difficult truths were often spoken softly. Snowlight filtered through the high windows, dull and white, casting long reflections across the linoleum floors. Scout slept curled inside his crate near the exam room wall, his breathing steady now, his body finally holding warmth without assistance. Emily Carter sat at her desk, with a thin folder open in front of her. She hadn't intended to look deeper, at least not at first. The intake paperwork listed Scout as surrendered, no address attached, no follow-up requested. But something about the handwriting had stayed with her. Careful, deliberate. The kind that belonged to someone who didn't rush decisions, even painful ones. She traced the name again. Frank Miller. It took her 2 days to find him. Frank arrived at the clinic on a Wednesday morning, leaning heavily on a cane that had once been polished wood, but was now scuffed and dulled by years of use. He moved slowly, every step measured, as though his body had learned the cost of hurry. In his early 70s, Frank was tall but shrunken by illness. His shoulders sloped inward, chest narrow beneath a worn brown coat that hung looser than it once had. His hair, white and thinning, was combed neatly back, and a gray mustache framed a mouth that rarely smiled, but did not harden either. His breathing was the first thing Mark noticed. It came shallow and uneven, accompanied by a faint wheeze that never quite faded. The sound of lungs that had known smoke, both kinds. Frank paused just inside the clinic doors, eyes adjusting, one hand resting on the frame, as if steadying himself against more than gravity. He scanned the room slowly, not searching, not hopeful, just checking. Emily approached him first. "Mr. Miller?" she asked gently. Frank nodded. "That's me." His voice was low and rough, worn thin but not bitter. "I heard you have my dog." Mark froze where he stood. Scout stirred at the sound of the voice, lifting his head slightly, ears twitching. Frank noticed. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in relief. "He's alive," Frank murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Emily gestured toward the exam room. "He is. He's doing well." Frank exhaled, a long, trembling breath that ended in a quiet cough. He turned his head away, embarrassed, and pressed a handkerchief to his mouth. When he lowered it, his eyes were wet. "I don't need to see him," he said quickly. "Not if that makes things harder. I just needed to know." Mark stepped forward before he could stop himself. "He's stronger," Mark said. His voice came out steady, but his chest tightened. "He taps when he's worried, eats slow, likes warm corners." Frank looked at him then. Really looked. Up close, Mark could see the lines etched deep into Frank's face. Not just age, but restraint. A man who had learned to keep his grief contained, packed away where it wouldn't spill. "You're the one who brought him in," Frank said. Mark nodded. "Found him in a drain?" Frank closed his eyes, his jaw clenched. "I was afraid of that." They sat together in the small consultation room, Scout between them in his crate. Emily remained nearby, but silent, sensing the space needed to belong to the two men. Frank rested both hands on his cane, knuckles pale. "I didn't abandon him," he said suddenly, as if responding to a charge no one had spoken aloud. "I left him at the shelter with his blanket, his food, all the notes." Mark didn't interrupt. "I got sick," Frank continued. "Lost the job first, then the apartment. The oxygen came after." He tapped his chest lightly. "Lungs don't bounce back once they're done." Scout made a small sound, barely audible. Frank's gaze flicked to the crate, softened instantly. "I couldn't keep him warm," he said. "Couldn't keep myself warm some nights. I had to choose." Mark felt something press hard against his ribs. "I let go," Frank said quietly. "Not because I stopped loving him, because I loved him enough to know I was failing him." The words hit Mark with a force he wasn't ready for. He saw it then, not just Frank, but a future version of himself. Older, thinner, alone. A man surviving quietly until there was no one left to notice. "You came to check on him," Mark said. Frank nodded. "That's all?" Scout shifted, pushing his nose weakly against the bars of the crate. Frank stilled. Slowly, carefully, he knelt despite the protest in his joints. He reached one hand through the opening, stopping short, giving Scout space to decide. Scout leaned forward. He pressed his nose into Frank's fingers and breathed out. Frank's breath broke. "That's enough," he whispered. "That's all I needed." Mark looked at the two of them and understood something essential. Scout hadn't just anchored him to the present. Scout had connected two men standing on opposite edges of the same fear. The fear of ending unseen. "You don't have to disappear," Mark said before he decided to speak. Frank looked up, startled. "I mean," Mark continued, voice rough, "you don't have to carry it alone." Frank studied him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Neither do you." Scout tapped once, soft, certain. For the first time in years, Frank laughed, a quiet sound, fragile but real. The address Frank gave Mark was written on the back of a folded receipt, the ink pressed deep as if the act of writing had required commitment. It led to a low brick building on the edge of town, half hidden behind a stand of winter bare cottonwoods. A hand-painted sign near the entrance read, "Veterans Maintenance Cooperative." The letters were uneven, repainted more than once, but the door beneath them was solid. Mark parked his truck and sat for a moment. Scout curled on the passenger seat, wrapped in a blanket. The puppy's breathing was steady now, his eyes brighter, tracking the movement of Mark's hands as he adjusted his gloves. Scout tapped once, light, familiar, then settled. "Back soon," Mark said quietly. He didn't promise. He just stated what he intended. Inside, the building smelled of sawdust, oil, and old coffee. The space was large and practical. Concrete floors, steel shelving, workbenches scarred by years of use. Tools hung on pegboards in deliberate rows. A radiator clanked somewhere, fighting the cold. The place felt lived in, but not welcoming, more like a test that hadn't yet decided if you were worth passing. A man stepped out from a side office. Raymond Cole, early 50s, thick through the shoulders, beard trimmed close, eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. His movements were economical, not unfriendly, but not indulgent either. A limp slowed his right side, the kind that never fully healed and never fully complained. "You lost?" Raymond asked. "No," Mark said. "I'm here to work." Raymond studied him from boots to jawline. Mark felt the old instinct to square up, to brace for evaluation. He didn't fight it. He stood where he was. "We're full," Raymond said, "and this isn't charity." "I'm not asking for charity," Mark replied. "I'll work a trial, unpaid." Raymond raised an eyebrow. "You think that proves something?" "It proves I'm still useful," Mark said. There it was, the thing Mark hadn't meant to say and couldn't take back. Raymond's gaze lingered. "We start at 6. You miss a day, you're done." "I won't miss," Mark said. The trial days were long and deliberately hard. Mark cleaned grease pits no one wanted to touch, hauled broken equipment across the lot, worked in the cold until his fingers burned. He didn't explain himself. He didn't ask for lighter tasks. He worked until his back ached and his hands shook, then worked a little more. At night, he returned home exhausted, Scout waiting by the heater, tail flicking weakly when Mark entered. Sometimes Scout tapped when Mark's shoulders locked from a dropped wrench or a sudden shout. Sometimes he didn't. Mark learned to notice before the taps. He learned to pause, to breathe, to stay. Raymond watched without comment. So did the others, men and women of different ages, most carrying injuries that had rewritten their bodies. No one asked Mark where he'd served. No one asked why he was quiet. The work spoke first. On the 5th day, Raymond called Mark into the office. "You're steady," he said. "You don't cut corners. You don't panic." Mark nodded. "I can keep going." Raymond slid a single-page contract across the desk. "You're in. Pays modest. Hours are real." Mark signed without hesitation. That afternoon, Mark returned to the clinic to tell Frank. He found the older man sitting near Scout's crate, hands folded over his cane, posture careful. Frank looked up, eyes searching. "They took me," Mark said simply. Frank exhaled, the relief unmistakable. "Good," he said. "They need men who finish things." Mark hesitated. Then he said, "They might need you too." Frank blinked. "No," he said, gentle but firm. "My lungs?" "I know," Mark said. "Not heavy work, storage, inventory, watering, things that matter but don't break you." Frank looked away, pride and fear crossing his face like weather. "I don't want a favor." "It wouldn't be," Mark said. "You'd be useful." Frank swallowed. The word landed carefully. The next morning, Mark stood in Raymond's office again. "I have a request," he said. "A veteran, older, pulmonary issues. He won't slow anyone down." Raymond leaned back, studying Mark. "Why him?" Mark answered honestly. "Because someone once told him he wasn't worth the trouble." Raymond nodded once. "Bring him tomorrow." Frank arrived wearing his cleanest coat, hair neatly combed, mustache trimmed. He moved slowly, but he stood straight. Raymond assigned him the tool room, cataloging, cleaning, keeping order. Frank took to it with quiet diligence, learning the layout, correcting labels, tending a few neglected plants by the windows. No one called it charity. They called it work. At lunch, Frank sat with Mark, hands wrapped around a warm mug. "I haven't had a place to be in a long time," he said. Mark nodded. "Me neither." That evening, they locked up together. Scout waited in the truck, tail wagging when Frank appeared. Frank rested a hand on the doorframe, breathing carefully, smiling despite himself. "He looks good," Frank said. "He's getting there," Mark replied. Scout tapped once against the seat, as if to agree. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a narrowing corridor. It felt like a door, small maybe, but open enough. Spring arrived quietly, not with warmth, but with permission. Snow retreated from the sidewalks in thin, uneven lines, revealing the dull gray beneath. Water dripped from eaves. The town exhaled. Mark noticed it in small ways. How Scout lingered longer at the doorway. How Frank no longer rushed to sit when he arrived. How mornings felt less like something to endure, and more like something to enter. They fell into routines without naming them. Cheap coffee from the gas station on the corner, the kind that tasted burned but stayed hot. Frank preferred it black, steadying the cup with both hands, breath still shallow but less anxious. Mark drank his with too much sugar, a habit he never corrected. They talked about practical things first, weather, work schedules, which hinge on the back door needed oiling. The important things came later, if at all. Frank moved into the small spare room above the garage after a night when the wind cut too sharply through his apartment walls. He insisted it was temporary. Mark didn't argue. The room stayed simple: a narrow bed, a lamp, a chair by the window. Frank brought little with him: medication bottles lined carefully on the dresser, a folded flag tucked into a drawer, a photograph of a younger man in uniform that he never displayed. Scout adapted fastest. His legs grew stronger, his appetite steadier, his coat thickened, the pale markings darkening into clearer lines. He slept where the warmth gathered, sometimes near Mark's boots, sometimes beside Frank's chair. He tapped less now, not because he was needed less, but because he trusted more. Frank watched Mark closely, though he pretended not to. He noticed how Mark paused before sudden noises, how his hands tightened before relaxing again. One afternoon, as they worked on a sticking door hinge, Frank handed Mark the oil without being asked. "You don't have to rush," Frank said. "Nothing's chasing us." Mark nodded, surprised by how easily the words settled. In return, Mark learned Frank's rhythms, which pills came with food, which ones waited, how long Frank could walk before his breathing turned brittle. Mark didn't hover. He simply remembered. He drove Frank to appointments without comment, sat in waiting rooms without checking the time, learned to listen for wheezing the way he once listened for distant threats. Scout stayed between them, tail thumping softly, eyes moving back and forth as if counting. On Sundays, they sat on the porch and watched the snow melt, carve thin paths through the yard. Frank talked then about the years after service, the jobs that ended quietly, the nights he stayed awake listening to his own breath. He spoke without drama, as if listing facts long overdue for acknowledgement. "I thought disappearing would be easier," Frank admitted once. "Less trouble for everyone." Mark stared out at the yard. "I used to think surviving was enough." Scout lifted his head at the change in tone. They didn't correct each other, they let the words stand. Emily visited one evening with a bag of supplies and an expression that suggested she'd guessed more than she'd been told. She watched Frank organize Scout's medication chart with careful hands, watched Mark kneel to adjust the puppy's blanket without being asked. "You've built something here," she said quietly. Frank smiled. "We're trying not to waste it." Emily nodded, satisfied. She left without advice. Life didn't fix itself. Work remained hard. Frank's lungs didn't improve. Mark still woke some nights with his heart racing. But the mornings came easier. Coffee tasted better when shared. Silence no longer meant danger. Scout grew into the space between them, not owned, not claimed. He answered to both voices, rested against both legs. 2 men, 1 dog, 1 home. Not perfect, just present. When summer finally broke through, Mark realized something had shifted. He wasn't being pulled forward anymore. He was walking. Frank noticed it too. "You're not bracing all the time," he said. Mark nodded. "Neither are you." Scout tapped once, then settled. The decision was made quietly, without ceremony, the way most necessary things were. It came not from pressure or policy, but from an understanding that had grown slowly between 3 lives, learning how not to cling. Scout belonged, legally and by responsibility, with Frank. Frank's health required consistency, medication schedules, monitored breathing, routines that steadied the days. Scout had once been part of that rhythm, and the bond between them hadn't vanished simply because time and hardship had intervened. The clinic paperwork confirmed what everyone already knew. Scout had an owner, and that owner had never stopped caring. Mark signed his name where it was needed, hand steady. He surprised himself with that. Frank moved back into his small rental on the south end of town, a modest, single-story place with a wide front porch and a railing Scout could rest his chin on. The house smelled faintly of menthol and old books. Frank kept it clean, but sparse, as if excess belonged to another life. He placed Scout's bed near the heater, set the bowls with careful symmetry, taped the medication chart to the fridge where it could not be missed. Scout adapted with the quiet resilience he'd always shown. He learned Frank's breathing patterns again, curled near his feet during long afternoons, followed him from room to room with watchful eyes. He slept lightly, always aware, always present. But Scout never forgot the sound of Mark's truck. Whenever Mark pulled into the maintenance cooperative lot, Scout's ears lifted. Sometimes he tapped the floor once, sometimes 3 times. Then he waited, tail still, body angled toward the door. Frank noticed and smiled. "Go on," he'd say, waving a hand. "He's not going anywhere." Scout trotted across the lot, paws quick and confident now, weaving between workbenches until he reached Mark. He pressed into Mark's legs, solid and warm, and tapped 3 familiar knocks against the concrete. Mark crouched, resting his forehead briefly against Scout's neck. Not clinging, just acknowledging. "I hear you," he murmured. "I'm here." Mark no longer panicked when Scout left again. He watched Frank walk him back, cane tapping in counterpoint to Scout's steps, and felt something steadier take root inside him. The fear that love only existed when it was held tight had loosened its grip. Frank changed too. He no longer rushed his evenings into silence. Mark visited often, sometimes to help fix a window latch, sometimes just to sit on the porch and share a thermos of coffee. Frank talked more freely now, not because loneliness had vanished, but because it no longer defined him. He spoke of old unit mates, of mistakes that still ached, of moments he'd once believed erased him. "You gave me something back," Frank said one evening, watching Scout chase moths near the porch light. Mark shook his head. "You kept it alive." Scout settled between them, body touching. Both knees. Emily noticed the change when she saw them together at a follow-up appointment. Frank stood taller. Mark's shoulders were lower. Scout moved easily between them, answering to both names spoken in different tones. "This looks right," Emily said quietly. It was. On the day Scout officially moved in with Frank full-time, Mark helped carry the last box inside. He lingered by the door, hands in his pockets, feeling the old reflex stir. "Stay, don't leave, don't let this end." Scout tapped once against the floor, then padded back to Frank, tail wagging. Mark exhaled. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. Scout looked back once, eyes bright. No fear, no confusion, just trust. Mark drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. He didn't need to. Some bonds didn't weaken with distance. They widened. That night, alone in his apartment, Mark slept through until morning, and across town, Frank slept too. Breathing steady, Scout warm at his side, the quiet no longer an echo. Spring finished what winter had started. The last patches of snow disappeared from the edges of the lot, replaced by soft mud and the faint green promise of new grass. At the Veterans Maintenance Cooperative, Mark stood at the fence line with a toolbox open at his feet, replacing warped boards one by one. The work was steady, unglamorous, and deeply satisfying. Each post he set straight felt like a quiet argument against the years he had spent bracing for collapse. Frank sat on the porch bench a few yards away, wrapped in a light jacket despite the mild air. The illness hadn't left him, but it no longer dictated the shape of his days. His posture was careful, his breathing measured, yet his eyes followed Mark's movements with something close to pride. The sun caught the silver in his thinning hair, and for a moment he looked exactly like what he had become, an elder still rooted in the present. Scout lay between them, stretched out in the warm dirt, ears half lifted, eyes drifting from one man to the other. He had grown into himself now. His body was lean but strong, his coat healthy and bright, his movements confident without being reckless. He no longer needed to tap often. The world, for the most part, made sense. Mark stepped back from the fence, wiping his hands on a rag. He caught Frank watching and smiled, small but genuine. "That last hinge should hold." Frank nodded. "You do solid work. Always have." Mark hesitated, then said it. "Thanks, Dad." The word landed without ceremony. Frank's breath caught, then steadied. He didn't correct it. He simply nodded once, eyes damp, and let the moment stand as proof that some titles were earned, not assigned. A car pulled into the lot, tires crunching softly over gravel. Emily stepped out, sleeves rolled, hair loose around her shoulders. She no longer wore her clinic coat. Today she looked like someone who had chosen to stay. Simple jeans, a faded sweater, hands unburdened by urgency. In her mid-30s, Emily carried herself with the ease of someone who had learned where she belonged. Her dark eyes took in the scene, Mark at the fence, Frank on the bench, Scout at the center, and softened. "I brought coffee," she said, lifting a paper bag. Frank chuckled. "That's how you get invited back." They sat together then. Coffee passed around, Scout shifting to keep contact with all three. Conversation flowed easily. Not about trauma, not about loss, about small things. A broken gate at the back of the lot, the neighbor's cat that kept stealing insulation, the way spring smelled different every year. Mark listened more than he spoke, noticing how his body stayed present. No tightening at sudden sounds, no urge to scan for exits. The memories were still there, but they no longer owned the room. Emily caught his eye. "You're quieter today," she said gently. "Good quiet," Mark replied. "The kind that doesn't hurt." She smiled and didn't push. Further. As the afternoon wore on, Scout rose and trotted the fence line, nose to the ground, tail swaying. He paused, looked back at the small group, then returned to settle at Mark's feet. Mark rested a hand on his head, feeling the warmth, the steady trust. For a long time, Mark had believed family was something assigned or lost, blood or absence. He understood now that it could also be chosen, built slowly through shared work, shared silence, shared care. PTSD hadn't vanished. It never would. But it had changed shape. It was no longer a wall. It was something he could live beside, something he could manage with routine, with help, with honesty. He had work that mattered, a community that noticed when he showed up. Frank, who had become a father not by authority, but by presence. Emily, who stood beside him not as a rescuer, but as a partner in the quiet days ahead. And sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. They arrive as small moments we almost miss. A hand that stays, a breath that steadies, a life that chooses not to disappear. Mark's journey reminds us that healing is rarely about being fixed. It's about being seen by a dog who listens, by a man who refuses to give up, by a community that opens a door just wide enough. The Bible tells us that God is close to the brokenhearted, and in this story, his presence didn't shout. It whispered, through Scout's quiet loyalty, through Frank's second chance, through the simple truth that no one was meant to carry their pain alone. If you're walking through a hard season right now, let this be your reminder. You are not forgotten. Your life still matters. And sometimes God sends help in forms we never expected. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it. Someone else may need this hope today. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if you believe in stories of faith, healing, and second chances, subscribe to keep them alive. May God bless you, protect you, and place the right souls in your path, just when you need them most.